Efforts in reducing the negative impact of loss of correspondent banking relationships in the Caribbean. The role of supervisors and financial institutions. Session 12. Effectiveness of the AML-CFT supervision, with a special focus on how important it is to apply sanctions. This session must be read jointly with the concepts reviewed in Session 1, general concept and FATF methodology to assess the effectiveness of the AML-CFT systems. Session 3. Expectations for Caribbean regulation and supervision authorities, especially regarding to imposing sanctions and directives. In Session 7, Best Practices, Methodology, and Standards in AML-CFT Supervision. FATF is particularly interested in the effectiveness of the AML-CFT systems, beyond technical compliance. And this is also a core aspect for correspondent banks when assessing the risks of their correspondent banking relationships. Since 2012, after the update of the FATF recommendations, the evaluation methodology changed to pay more attention on the effectiveness of the system. As analyzed in previous sessions, applying sanctions, providing directives, strong supervision is considered an international sign of effectiveness. This is important because we're talking about the Caribbean countries that must show that the AML systems are effective to be subject of de-risking by international bank decreases. In consequence, it can be stated that practicing strong supervision is a tool to reduce de-risking. Supervisors constantly ask themselves how to improve the methods and practices to perform their tasks to have, as what we see here, strong supervision is a tool to reduce de-risking. So it is important to consider that sanctions and directives are the result of a complex process. For this reason, in this session, we will focus on the supervision process as such tools, sanctioning mechanism, etc., and then we will analyze the supervision aspects that are directly related to correspondent banking activities. But why sanctions and directives are the result of a complex process? Because supervisors have to evaluate a process regarding the AML program and be sure the program complies with the local regulations to start in case is needed a sanction process. It always depends on the legal framework of each country. In the Peruvian case, for instance, a sanction process can take a year since the sanction proposal and the final resolution is issued by the local authorities. Just as a reminder, because we already talked about this graphic in previous section, you can take a look to see where and how the regulation process works. Why risk assessment is so important? Because the information obtained regarding the MLFT risks of entities under supervision must be analyzed. And also, we must understand the likelihood of these risks occurring on the supervised institutions, the banking sector, and on the national economy on a large scale. Sometimes the risk of one institution, mainly if it's a systematic institution, can affect the whole economy of a country. In 2015, for instance, a Honduras bank was included in a blacklist and it only took 2 weeks to close the bank, and they had to face a challenge to improve the system to show other countries, banks and supervisors they can continue with correspondent banking relationships. The risk factors to be considered are nature, scale, diversity, and complexity of business, depending on the institution complexity. Volume and size of transactions, the jurisdictions to which the bank is exposed, and the internal audit and regulatory findings. Understanding the likelihood of these risks will help us to go to the next step, which is planning and scoring. Once a risk assessment is made, it is very important to score the risk of each supervised entity by prioritized material and human resources for supervision activities, having as a result the supervision matrix with risk-based approach. The execution is the most important aspect while reviewing the work of regulation as supervision authority. Supervisor must see the quantitative and qualitative aspects, the number of inspections planned versus number of inspections performed, on-site, off-site, number of directives provided, sanctions applied per inspection, and duration of each inspection. This is why FATF Evaluator will look for how many inspections the supervisors have done, how many sanctions have applied, and the amount of the fines. This is important especially in context of national economies. The qualitative aspects that an evaluator may see are the level of observance of the directives by supervised institutions, the technical compliance and effectiveness of their AML-CFT systems, the technical level and experience of employees in charge of the inspections, and the usability of the information obtained. The stage of communication gives supervisors the results of inspections that should be communicated to the financial institutions. As mentioned before, the response to these communications becomes a tool to combat de-risking and should be maintained even once inspections are finished. For example, when the phenomenon of de-risking started in 2014, some countries started a relationship with bank associations to find out the issues, and why some American and European banks enhanced due diligence measures against Latin American banks. So it was necessary to work with them and improve the view of our systems among them. Monitoring implies the consistency of inspection documents information with the business model of supervised institutions and their clients, and the identification of changes in a business models that could affect the MLFT exposure. For example, if a bank has a retail bank and now is going into the agricultural business, this new line will affect the MLFT exposure. Where automated systems are used, it is important to understand their operating rules and verification of their integrity on a regular basis. Also, it is important the transparency of criteria applied to decide the frequency and intensity of monitoring of various supervised entity segments. When a supervisor sees the systems and the institutions, they ask for a formalization in a reading and approved document by the compliance officer and the board of directors. Now, let's go to the supervision process and sanctioning process. Regarding to observations and recommendations, we must take into account that some sanctions come from the supervision process. There are other sanctions that come from outside supervision or other sources. For example, if a financial institution does not communicate to the FIU within a framework of time the designation of the compliance officer that represents an infringement of the rules, then a sanction will be issued. Supervisors also have to make observations and findings on recommendations based on the deficiencies found in internal policies or the lack of application of these, according to the sample assessment carried out. These observations are communicated to the financial institution together with the recommendations. Take into account here that the word recommendations means an order. Financial institutions must comply with them as they are not optional, they are mandatory. About the sanctioning process. It starts when there's a lack of application or wrongdoing, a non-compliances with regulations. The conduct must be contrasted with the sanctioning regulation. The non-compliance of implementation period of recommendations is also sanctioned. How's a correspondent banking assessment methodology? As we already mentioned in previous sessions, supervisors look for the foreign bank's risk assessment by the exposure assessment by relationships and volumes of transactions and bank's global exposure from correspondent banking. This is the criteria we already mentioned in previous sessions. And the activities derived from CB assessment. Once the risk assessment is made, the regulation and supervision authority is in condition to perform derived activities. These are supervision activities, regulatory directive, penalties for de-risking. The supervision activities start when one correspondent bank is involved in a criminal case, for instance. Supervisors start an on-site supervision immediately to check how strong was the AML program for the correspondent banking. That means to check if the bank was involved in the criminal case and the effect of it in credit or operational risks. About the regulatory directive. There's some advances on a directive regarding only about correspondent banking relationships to define the concepts and establish which are the basis of controls to be applied about general relationships and enhance risk relationships. And about penalties for de-risking, in the Peruvian case for instance, institutions are starting a process to de-risk specific economic sectors. Here you can see a resume of the high-risk correspondence due diligence files. Also a review of correspondent contracts and analysis of controls and monitoring of correspondent operations. And how we can understand the legal framework, and we use tests to see how the transaction goes in a correspondent banking relationship. Here we can see the regulatory directive for correspondent banking, which we already discussed in previous sessions. And here, even though we already talked about the slide, I'll retake the last part, which is about the difference between correspondent banking that has a contract, SWITF exchange, and the difference with foreign trade operations. These three different relationships should be managed separately. Each one has their own characteristics, and not all of them are correspondent banking relationships. For these reasons, it's better to have a better standard of them. If we go through the FATF glossary correspondent banking is the provision of banking services by one bank, the correspondent bank, to another bank, the respondent bank. Large international banks typically act as correspondents for thousands of other banks around the world. Respondent banks may be provided with a wide range of services, including cash management, interest-bearing accounts in a variety of currencies, international wire transfers, check clearing, payable through accounts and foreign exchange services. Correspondent banking does not include one-off transactions or the mere exchange of SWIFT relationship management application keys. In the context of non-customer relationships, but rather is categorized by its ongoing repetitive nature, here you can see an abstract of the Correspondent Banking Services Guidance of 2016 that says, the SWIFT RMA is a messaging capability enabling SWIFT members to exchange messages over the network and can create a non-customer relationship in particular cases of cash management, custody, trade finance, exchange of messages with payments and securities, markets infrastructure entities, example exchanges depositories. So as we mentioned, we have to establish minimum information requirements and due diligence, expand the scope of the enhanced regime, need of increasing the customer due diligence level, increase frequency of monitoring the operations of those banks in the enhanced regime, importance of the ongoing controls, and establish obligation to apply due diligence to third parties that participate in operations. Correspondent of the correspondent and respondent of the respondent. First, there is no common standard for sanctioning financial institutions for de-risking certain sectors or customers. There is not a common base in the international regulation. Because of this, do international bodies have to create mechanisms to avoid de-risking events? The answer is yes. FATF and all the institutions that establish the rules that banking supervisors must apply have a strong statement in the last 3 years in recommendation and guidelines to avoid de-risking, because this process means that in the first instance, the risk is not accepted. And when it happens, financial institutions must be sure to have enough arguments to not do it. And as supervisors, they must be sure financial institutions have enough arguments to conduct a de-risking process. The risk has to be managed to reduce it or mitigate it by using the correct tools and systems and continue with the business line as long as they're complying with the regulation required. The casinos are a good example. Even though the challenge that type of business represents, we must create tools to control them and being able to apply the necessary regulatory measures instead of eliminating them from the process. Taking into consideration that correspondent banking relationships are business relationships, are their terminations sanctionable by supervisors? In the Peruvian case, this is a challenge we usually don't face because the correspondent banks are based on the USA, Europe, or Asia, and these questions don't have a unique answer. Basel core principles establish that FI may not work with a certain economic sector or industry. But prior to this, the FI must develop a proper procedure to determine when these rules apply. Impact of sanctions for de-risking regardless of the answers to the aforementioned questions. Sanctions could help combat de-risking because they're a sign of effectiveness of the AML CFT systems. They could correct the production of indiscriminate de-risking events. Sanctions to correspondent banks. Whenever a FI is sanctioned for an infringement, the possibility of being affected by de-risking actions for correspondent banks increases. This is the paradox of the system. Why? Because, on one hand, FATF and other international bodies imposes the obligation to apply sanctions, and when it happens, what sees the correspondent bank? The non-compliance with the local regulation, so at the end, correspondent bank could de-risk the local bank. Whenever this happens, it is important to document and explain to the correspondent bank the main reasons why the sanction was applied and how the FI will or is correcting the situation. Conclusion. Although sanctioning financial institutions could feed back de-risking, sanctions could be considered as a tool for combating this phenomenon. We need to find a balance between the effect of sanctions have on reputational risk and the effect of the AML system. Thank you, see you in the next section.